All right, and we are live with episode 6 of Sundered Ages Talks. We're back for part 2 of combat and such. On Tuesday, we talked about weapons, simple and martial. We talked about iterative attacks, based on class and the old base attack breakdown, some attack rolls, and crits. And so all those things are going to be coming back up today, but in our Sundered Ages system, in the classless system.
Oh man. So, when you first started Sundered Ages, I want to start with a fun little thing. God, what, like 6 years ago? Was it 8 years ago? I don't even remember.
It was before you moved, so it'd be
Yeah,
five, five
five,
or six. Yeah.
5 or 6 years ago. So I remember the baseline of the game being written, and we had all the mechanics out, and we were play testing with a new group that we had just started playing with. And the first iteration of the game went seemingly well until was it the first combat that someone got more or less decapitated, or just run through.
The first game, the second or third combat,
There you go.
Chris got skewered by 3 arrow shots, like someone had hit him up with a modern firearm and just killed him. Which it seemed extreme at the time, but if you think about it now, like you guys were level 1, and even in a regular D&D system, he was a mage type character. If he had like 6 health, which would have been a lot for a wizard, getting hit by 3 short bows still would have killed him. But
Yeah,
it just seemed extreme.
Right now, if I got shot with 3 arrows and I wasn't able to be taken to the hospital, I'd undoubtedly die. So, but the reason I'm bringing that up is I remember a big part of what we talked about is we wanted criticals and we wanted combat to feel great and dangerous, right? Because part of, especially when you've been playing the game a lot, it's so easy to meta without even knowing you're doing it. So it's very easy to know the mechanics and know, like, yeah, that person with a short bow couldn't possibly kill me in 1 round.
I'm safe. I don't have to worry about it because I know that.
You're doing the math in your head, and you're like, well, they can't. Like, I know the maximum amount they could do. Like, without knowing how much strength or dexterity they have, you could still probably guess they're not going to kill me in 1 round. It's going to take at least 2 rounds, assuming they hit both times. But with Sundered Ages, at least the first iteration, that was not true. Man, you could get. I mean, he got ran through with 3 arrows, but still, it was very dangerous. We wanted the game.
Catherine getting run through. She was the only character with armor. She had like a chain shirt on, and the bandit, the also level 1 bandit, crit her with a bastard sword and just murdered her. Tore her into 2 pieces, and the rest of you just became slaves for 1 game.
Yeah. But it was great. Like, it was exciting, even though 2 or 3 of us died and it was just me and Tyler left. Like, it was bananas. Like, it felt fun. It was very visceral. People were like, holy shit, this is real.
It set stakes.
Yeah, and I know part of the reason Sundered Ages came up is because we wanted that again. We wanted that visceral feeling. We wanted to be immersed back in the game. We wanted combat not just to be fun, but to like literally put you on the edge of your seat. Because it's so easy to get back into the role of what, the old stuff. If I went back to playing Pathfinder, and I haven't played it in years now, since we've started Sundered Ages, I haven't played any. I've played 5th a little bit, but I probably still wouldn't get that feeling with Pathfinder because it's so routed in my brain now. That I still know all this stuff. So I think a good way to start is just talking about combat in general, like sort of the motivation for you as the principal, of Sundered Ages. What was the biggest the motivation for making the new system and basing around combat? Like, obviously we wanted it to feel more dangerous and things, but like sort of your take on the changes that you've made and why in a general.
No, one, I wanted it to be brutal might not be the right word, but I wanted combat to feel like combat. Like, so often it seems like you go in and it's just like, oh, like, we're only level 1 or 2 or 3 or whatnot. And so we definitely nothing. We don't really have anything to fear, right? It's like you're not gonna get in a random encounter at level 2. No one has a chance of dying. Everything is you're fighting a bunch of things that are like half a CR. And then by the time that you get to level 10, level 12, 14, because you've been like swimming in that pool of like combat isn't truly dangerous, your mindset is wrapped up completely in that. And then when someone does die, unless it's done in the coolest and most heroic way, oftentimes people they get upset, like their character died, or other players will get upset for them when they think like that was just a bad roll, that was one bad call, and the person died for it, and is that fair? And it's like, well, you might not feel like it's fair because really you haven't been playing by those rules the whole time you've had these characters. Like, you didn't think combat was this always dangerous thing. It's you're in the room before the dragon, you turn like around the corner, you see the dragon, and now everybody sits down, pulls out like a war table, and you guys start going over exactly how this is going to be done because it's dangerous. But if you were doing the same thing outside of like an orc encampment, and the rogue looks around and he's like, okay, there's 3 of them, you might go like, all right, the archer's going to shoot first, and then we're going to charge in. But you don't go at it like you're thinking tactically like, okay, every combat is dangerous. Like, we need to. This is it's a life and death thing. People are running around with axes and swords and slinging spells. How do we minimize this damage? And most importantly, how do we play as a team? Because that like combat should be a team effort. If D&D most often is a team game, people complain all the time about like, oh, that one guy, or oh, my group just sort of runs around. DMs talk about their players having like herding cats is like getting players to do stuff. But it should feel like a team game, and combat is a team game in Sundered Ages. And when you play it that way, when you understand how the system works, you get to feel like a hero, still pulling off all these amazing feats of, even making it look easy because you think things through, or at the very least, even when you're surprised, you know what the other characters are capable of, right? It's not just a fighter. You're like, oh, that's the guy. He specializes in heavy armor and two-handed weapons. That person's, a more dexterous character. They've got the shield, or they're always fighting defensively or whatnot. You know what the strengths and weaknesses are of everybody because no one is just a general class. And so you can agree on what your jobs are going to be in combat and sort of fall into that routine that like an actual group of soldiers might do, wherein they know what each person is best at, and they're going to play to those strengths and minimize the weaknesses. And that was the goal. Also, I have always thought armor should reduce incoming damage and not just stop damage altogether. I like AC. I get why AC works the way it does and why it has for so long, because you'd have to recalculate the health system. Like, hint, hint, we did. If armor is reductionary rather than dodge based, but it just it feels so much better because, just because you have plate mail, doesn't mean that like a bunch of guys swinging glaives at you, they should still all be hitting you. Most of the time, especially if you're in plate mail, like you're probably not that maneuverable. They should be hitting you, and if they're hitting you, even if they're not very good and you are very good, there should still be some sort of effect on you. Which for us, we have like minimum damage rules when you get hit. Even if your armor is a higher value than what their damage is, there's still minimum damage rules so that you could never just wade through an infinite number of people. In D&D now, still, your tanky character, your fighter that specialized, in defense, with his like weapon style or whatnot, can still wade through a sea of small creatures. He's got no stamina, so he can attack forever. If his AC is high enough, he will only get hit on a 20. he's got a lot of these times he's got like a 5 or 10% chance of being hit and taking any damage at all. And if he's not hit, they don't break his AC, then it's nothing. It's like the enemy didn't even attack to begin with. And I wanted to get away from that. And the whole combat system was built around that. And then everything else on the other side of it had to be built up to make it feel cool and balanced.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to just jump in on that too, because there is a sense of accomplishment now, right? With the team-based aspect of the game. I think because it's more inherent, the danger that can, in the game itself, that you can be more immersed, find the danger. There's a sense of accomplishment when you do the teamwork, rather than Leroy Jenkinsing your way through an entire game, which when I read a lot of stuff online, it sounds like a lot of it happens that way. And only the really fun stories are the ones where people had to plan and prepare and strategize. And that's where the fun stories come from. And that's where you feel like a team and things feel great. But yeah,
people remember those fights. They're like, oh, we had to fight the Lich and we had to, figure out how we were going to do it. But how awesome would it be if every game that had combat in it that you played and you were like, oh man, like we did such a good job fighting X or Y because the fight wasn't a meaningless fight to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't just numbers and running in and feeling strong. It was actually completing something, accomplishing something. So let's talk about, the reason I brought it up was because I think Kat at the time, she'd got crit. And that was one of the things we talked about on Tuesday, and it was one of the things that we had to, at first, I think we agree that the way we had dealt with crits, or the way you had dealt with crits, I think with both of us, wasn't going to work in the long term. No. And it's basically what is being used now, right? It's either a version of max damage or double dice. It's essentially just more damage.
It's just more
right?
damage. It's you just hit real hard.
And I think anybody who was just listening to the last minute can understand a game that feels inherently more dangerous and more realistic, more damage is even scarier, and it doesn't work out, and then it turns out to not be fun. So you actually found a really interesting way to deal with that and make it even more interesting. So let's talk about that for a second.
And still dangerous.
Still dangerous.
All right, yeah. So, for one, and dealing also with the making everything customized. I was like, "Don't stand right behind me," and she's like, "I'm just gonna stand right behind you."
I'm gonna stand right behind you.
Stand right behind me. No. So there's a to make it feel fun, to make it feel different. Even in the regular D&D games, you have someone that you've got like the guy with the long sword and a guy with an axe, and it's like, and a guy with a mace, and it's like, oh yeah, they all do D8, right? And in 5th edition, it's like, oh, they all do D8, but the longsword's versatile, and so you can use it in one hand or two, and the whatever. Like, it's small differences. Some people might like it. There are some minor benefits to it. I wanted all the weapons to feel different. And so the weapons are all different. So while we have categorized our weapons into skills by whether they're sort of a light weapon, whether they're something you'd use one-handed, or whether they're a heavier weapon, something you'd use two-handed, they break down further into what kind of weapon they are. Are they a bladed weapon? Are they a piercing weapon? Are they a blunt? Or are they a wedge? A wedge being like an axe and the like. And then each of those does their own thing in combat, either for regular hits, and then also for crits. And so the first thing... there it goes. Monitor went off. So, like, for example, bladed weapons, when they crit, they do bleed damage to a person. And the numbers are fairly small, because bleed... I don't want bleed to be some, like, you stab the guy and, like, all his blood bursts out of his back like a 1990s anime, and he's just, like, dead.
Yeah.
No, but instead, you put bleed, it's a damage over time kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we use health, stamina, and mana. Health being what keeps you alive, stamina being what lets you do physical actions, mana casting spells. Bleeding takes from your health and your stamina. So if you're bleeding, you're getting tired faster. And if you're in a fight, if you tire out before the fight's over, you start taking penalties for it. You can't make those attacks, and you can push yourself to exhaustion and just put yourself into an unconscious state because you've overexerted yourself. So bleed is dangerous. But other weapons, if the blunt weapons are very different. When you hit with a blunt weapon, they ignore some armor because I wanted it to make sense, and that is what makes sense. Historically, like you didn't go after the guy in plated armor with a sword. You went after him with something that you could hit where the force would go through the metal and break bones underneath that would cause welts, that would cause damage, that you could hit the helmet, right, so hard. And the blade on the sword, you were more likely to just break the blade, or if you've ever seen an actual like medieval sword hit something, it goes all wavy because it's not brittle, or it's purposely made not brittle, it should bend. The mace was to solve that. So maces ignore some armor. But more than that, if you crit with a mace, it means you've hit so hard that you've actually broken bones. And so we've got a whole chart. Did you break tibia, femur, radius, humerus, rib cage, or the skull? And so you'd crit, you'd confirm it, and then you roll again on the chart to see what you hit. And each one of those could fundamentally change the way that battle is going, depending on what you're critting, right? Like if you are fighting something, you're fighting somebody that is like a player character, using a weapon. If you break either of the bones in their arm, like you may have effectively just rendered them, useless in the thing that they were best at, the thing that made them dangerous.
Right.
And so it's a cool moment. And then wedge weapons are ones that they're the only one of the group where when you crit with them, you do some stamina damage, but you also do what we refer to now as crushing. Which is you hit them for a certain amount of damage that just completely ignores armor. Like you just, through armor, through bone, just straight damage.
Okay. It's almost like true damage.
Yeah, like true damage. And so you can be a one-handed character or a two-handed character as far as what your martial skill is if you're in melee. And you can still decide on if you want to use a specific kind of weapon and take feats related to that specific kind of weapon, and then you get to feel cool. Every attack made with that weapon has a secondary effect. Every crit made with that weapon has a secondary effect that you can't replicate without using a weapon of that type. So you can feel special. You can decide if you want to have more than one weapon for different situations. Like people, the only thing I can think of in standard D&D where that would be a thing is, having like a mace for fighting undead. Right, where they ignore a certain amount of damage from like a piercing or slashing source, so you would use a blunt weapon. But that's really the only, that's the only thing that's ever happened in standard D&D to sort of shake it up and get people to use different weapons for specific reasons other than just rule of cool, like I use 2 short swords because I'm a badass, right?
Yeah.
So crits is big. Every time someone crits, they get super excited. And yeah, it can fundamentally change the way that battle is going. Not just you crit. Okay, so instead of doing 1d8 plus 4, you did 8 plus 4, and roll another 1d8. Okay, that's a 2. You did 14 damage. Like, good job, champ.
That's awesome. It's just another way that people can separate themselves, and that adds to the story. Again, that adds to when I read these stories, I mean, all of that stuff in a classless system, it just builds into I'm this super unique thing, and I'm the only type of person that could have this situation. And it's going to be really interesting because you're going to find yourself, you're going to specialize, you're going to do the thing, and you're like, holy shit, that was awesome. And people are going to be like, oh my god, I want to do that.
Yeah, I can't wait until, we've had maybe 15 to 20 people play so far. By the time we get to 100 and I have the feedback from all those people, I can't wait to hear the stories, because that sort of stuff happens in our stream all the time. And just once people know they can make whatever character they wanted, they could specialize in whatever it is that excites them the most. I'm super excited to get the feedback on the awesome games these people are gonna have.
Yeah. So let's move on to iterative attacks. So this one was the heft of our last talk, and I think it was an interesting one to deal with because, like you said, we wanted it to. Part of the problem originally with iterative attacks were they take too long. Physically, just take you have to roll 9 times. You have to add all the numbers, all of it is just bananas. You feel strong, but there's certainly an easier way to do it, and I think a lot of people had better ways that they were already homebrewing. But it's annoying to have to do that, right? Especially if you're a player and you've played with separate groups, especially if there's a lot of different homebrews. There's going to be not a lot of consistency. So I think if there's someone who came up with a good way, it'll be nice for people to be able to, if you're a serial team or a serial group jumper, it'll be nice to have consistency. So what are some of the ways that you guys sort of dealt with that?
Okay, well, as far as the iterative attacks, just to hit on that first, there aren't really. So normal in standard D&D D20 games, you have a base attack bonus or some equivalent therein. As you level up, it gets higher. Eventually, it spawns off a second attack, a third attack. Or in D&D 5th edition, it's not based on that. It's based on your class, and you get extra attack. And then, if you're a fighter, you get extra attack 3 times for 4 attacks at level 20. At least as a weapon master, you do.
Right.
Your level has absolutely nothing to do with how many attacks you get in Sundered Ages. The number of attacks you get is based on the kind of weapon you're using. So, in the example we kept going to on Tuesday, the guy that played in one of my old games, Paul, with his Dwarf Ranger, it's insane to think of just how fast he would have to be moving to do 9 attacks in 4 seconds. In 6 seconds. In 6 seconds, sorry, yeah. He's hasted, so you're like, okay, well, he's fast. Even without the haste, 7 attacks, he's hitting.
Yeah, even without magic.
Faster than once per second.
Yeah.
And he's landing these hits, and any of these hits could be a legitimate critical hit, and he's doing this multiple times in 6 seconds. It's ridiculous. I love magic settings, but I strive for the suspension of disbelief that comes with internal consistency. So, in Sundered Ages, if you are using a heavy weapon, a greatsword, a maul, a glaive, something two-handed, you get 1 attack per round. All of your bonus to hit, your bonus to damage, the overall damage, your bonus to damage from strength, the overall damage that the weapon itself carries, the secondary effects for bleed, crushing bones, doing damage, all that stuff is figured in so that the weapons can be different, and 1 hit on a two-handed weapon is a real question of when you look at your character. If I'm using a two-handed weapon, I might do, for example, 25 damage on 1 hit. Not at level 1, mind you. At level 1, you might say, using this one-handed weapon, or two-handed weapon, I might do 10 damage out on 1 hit. And if I used a one-handed weapon, I could do 6 damage, maybe 7 damage, twice. I get 2 attacks. And so you think, okay, well, one-handed sounds better because one-handed weapons get to attack twice. But we're using an armor system. So one guy hitting for 10 against a person, say, that has like 3 armor, means he's doing 7 damage after armor. If that same person with the one-handed is hitting twice for 7, he does 4 damage twice. That still puts him 1 point ahead. If he hit both times, and his bonus to hit will be slightly lower than the guy that's attacking once with the two-handed.
But if he had 7 armor, that other guy's doing minimum damage.
Yeah, if that guy has 7 armor, if he's got like a chainmail on or something, the guy swinging the one-handed weapon is going to be hitting for minimum damage. The guy with the two-handed weapon is going to be doing almost double his damage with one hit.
Yeah.
And it's a game of, really, it's like, what weapon do you bring to what fight?
Yeah, it's very tactical.
Ranged weapons are the same way. Crossbows make 1 attack per round. Bows make 2 attacks per round. Crossbows get the benefit of they have a higher crit rating than a bow does. And they have an effect on them that immediately punches through a certain amount of armor when they're used close range. So even then, it's a question
makes sense.
You might go, like, in D&D, for the longest time, crossbows were terrible. Like, no matter what edition you were playing, they were terrible compared to bows. Like, crossbow was the weapon that someone that wasn't a ranged character used, because everyone thought of them like a gun that you'd keep preloaded at your waist, and you just, like, whip it out and shoot it at somebody.
Yes. That's what I used it for.
But you didn't specialize in crossbows. It wasn't like, oh, there's Legolas, and he's got his arbalist, right?
No,
like,
it'd
be like,
I'm a mage, and I ran out of spells, and I don't want to use my orisons because they suck.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Shot across the bow on orisons. No. But so, iterative attacks, the only 2 times in the game that you could point to what might be considered iterative attacks is if you're a pugilist, which means you specialize in hand-to-hand fighting and combat maneuvers and that sort of thing. You only get 1 unarmed attack. That's the standard. If you're fighting with your fists, you have 1 attack per round. But someone with training in pugilism can gain a 2nd attack. It goes at the same bonus. It's a feat that you take. So even then, it's not like a standard iterative, you gain this at X level.
It's still almost like a weapon specialization because you're specifically using your fists.
It's the same thing as when the person with a one-handed weapon for a sword takes the feat to increase their threat range, right?
Right.
And the other one would be if you choose to dual wield weapons, you take a penalty to hit, and you take a penalty to the stamina cost for your offhand weapon, so that it is exorbitantly more expensive to use 2 weapons. There are feats you can take to lower that, just like the kind of things you'd find in standard D&D, where you'd have like 2 weapon proficiencies, and it would start at a -8 and then -6, -4, -2, whatever. It's a similar thing. There's one feat, maybe 2 for two-handed or for dual wielding weapons that make them more viable, so that a regular person just picks up 2 weapons. It's not going to work so well for them, like, without any kind of training. But even then, like, that may not be, an iterative attack in the way that most people think about it. And still, the most attacks you're squeezing out of that, if you're using a light or a one-handed weapon in your main hand and something in your offhand, you'd get 2 attacks with the main, 1 with the off, and that'd be it. There is no, like, ending up with 7 attacks because you're dual wielding. It's just 3 attacks, and they're all going at the same bonus. So you can just throw three d20s down, as long as you know if you're using different weapons, which one is which weapon, and you'd be done. And so combat goes so much faster. It's so much faster, and people can feel like the choice they make as far as what kind of weapons they want to use and specialize in makes a real difference.
Nice. Sorry, I was listening to your thing to make sure it was still working. That's great. I think the only criticism I could see is, what if someone does want to have 7 attacks? Do you say, well, you think you want it, but you don't? Or do you think in future versions, when there's an easier balance for that many, that would be a possibility? Where do you think Sundered Ages would fall on, if you could guess, for that spectrum?
I would say, as far as 7 attacks, I don't see anyone ever having that unless they have 7 arms, right? You and the other people that play in the group that runs the Sundered Ages campaign and all that right now have come across things that have 3 or 4 attacks per round because they're multi-armed things, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they were humanoids or something that only had 2 arms like players, then they'd be restricted by the same rules that players are. Which is another big thing in my system. If you're a player and you see an enemy do something and it's not some special racial thing they have, like having extra limbs or wings, you should be able to do that same thing with training, like with time and specialization in it. I mean, the most that I think you'd be able to get, there is a haste spell in the game for Alterationists, so you could add another attack. You could get 4 attacks if you were dual wielding. And I think at the very least, for ranged weapons, there is the equivalent as an enchantment that you can put on a bow that would get you up to 3 attacks per round, and a feat you can take for ranged weapons that'll allow you to make yourself stationary instead of moving to give yourself an extra attack at penalty. But that's it. I mean, 7... The thing is, the system is based around... The system, health, dodge, armor, weapon damage are all based around having a more realistic number of attacks going back and forth each round. It's not a bullet hell game, right, where you're dodging 1,000 strikes. It's more, it's more like Dark Souls. Like, you're measuring these things out. You're deciding what kind of risk versus what kind of reward you want. And with like a minimum damage system, someone with 7 attacks might say, like, oh, if I'm doing minimum damage, possibly I have some sort of like magical bonus on this, like it does frost or fire or shock or poison or something. Hitting 7 times for minimum and adding a secondary effect on it could be really, really strong and just subvert all kinds of other systems. And I think that's a thing that has happened more than once in 3.x, Pathfinder, 4th edition, and even into 5th. Like, we're trying to avoid those things with Sundered Ages. We're trying to build, or we built, and will continue to refine, a combat system that is balanced but still fun because you get to make all the choices yourself.
Yeah. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was sort of... You had already said that every class can more or less use any weapon, especially... Well, there's no classes. Everybody can use any weapon, especially because, you more or less specialize in the one-handed or the two-handed, and then you can choose the type, whether it's like a slashing or piercing or whatever. But one thing specifically that I know I've done was... So, like, exotic weapons are what the equivalent of exotic weapons, and martial weapons. So, how does that fall in? I know that sometimes there were feats. Some people had their own homebrew versions of how to do it. How does Sundered Ages deal with more exotic weapons and how they fall onto... Or maybe, let's say there was a weapon that isn't even on the list, right? I'm a history buff. Right, I have a degree, and I know that this incredibly unique weapon that I really want to have my character use isn't in the book. I know how it's used, and it might be a wedge weapon. How would I integrate that if I wanted to? So, how does that break down? And if someone wanted to integrate it, how easy would it be, or how difficult would it be?
Okay, that would actually be really, really easy because the way that it's set up now. The chart of weapons shows you sort of the gradations of starting with daggers and punching daggers all the way through like a full blade. What's the damage of these things? What's the type that they have? Blade, pierce, blunt, wedge. what's the stamina cost, and those are the three things that factor in. If you're using a ranged weapon, there's also the question of what's the range on it, right?
Yeah.
But so you could easily fit it into one of those three things. A number of weapons also have some sort of secondary effect. They're better at something. Maybe they give you a slight bonus to making trip attacks or disarms. A lot of exotic weapons fall into that category where you've got something like the Falcata that has a threat range like a sword, but is treated as a wedge weapon for critical hits, right? Like things and like that is an example of maybe a historical weapon. People really like the Roman Iberian War kind of thing with like the heavy blades. It's easy to fit that in. As far as exotic weapons, it goes two ways. One, there's just a feat for exotic weapons. You get a feat every single level of the game for your character. So, we're shooting for that same sort of level 18 to 20 would be what you'd consider like epic, where your character is the best kind of, like the most powerful that you'd expect a mortal to be, right? And at that point, you realistically could have mastered like 3 or 4 things completely. Exotic weapons, so you have 18, 20 feats. That's an investment of 1 feat. It's not a lot. If you don't have the feat for exotic weapons, you just take a penalty to hit. But additionally, if the higher your training with the type that weapon would be in, the less that penalty is anyways. So if you're a novice, you have no real training with one-handed weapons, and you pick up a Falcata and you're like, I'm going to use this, it looks cool, it's badass, I'm going to, whatever. You might be suffering like a -6 to your hit, which is a fairly big penalty.
That's pretty, yeah.
But by the time you have gone, a third to halfway up the skill chart for one-handed from investment, instead of a -6, you're only taking like a -2 or -3. And by the time you make it 3/4 of the way up, and you become, an expert in one-handed, there's no penalty whatsoever. You're now considered to have been so well trained in that type of combat, those type of weapons. Exotic weapons are now the kinds of things that just make sense to you. And so that the feat that you took is not just a throwaway. Once you reach that level of specialization in one-handed, two-handed, ranged, whatever you're using, that feat then just gives a bonus to hit rather than negating the penalty to hit. So it never becomes a useless feat like some things in other editions. So, and that's the case with a lot of feats, actually, is you can take them early on, they give you a bonus, and then when you reach a higher tier of that skill, they either double up on that bonus or they bring a new bonus to you.
That's excellent.
Yeah, so that you continue to feel like you can look ahead, and you can say, wow, okay, picking heavy armor would give me this benefit. And you look at the feats and you're like, wow, I could actually stack a lot of these things together and really make like a character concept out of this.
That's excellent. I think that's great. I'm really excited. I've obviously played the game. I mean, that's no surprise to anyone. But I think the ability to create a character, to create your own class, essentially, is what it is. It's classless, so you're just making something that's entirely new. To, if you end up being a martial character rather than a magic one, you choose a weapon that maybe half the people choose, even. But then you level and put your feats into something that only a quarter people have chosen. And then you do all these other things. Like, I see that pretty much everybody who plays the game is going to find a way to be different. Like, you've heard of the thing where if you shuffle a deck of cards, chances are it's never been, like, in that order ever. Just because the amount of permutations that the cards could be in, because there's so many. That's how I feel it is with the classless system. There's so many feats that you can take. There's so many weapons you can use. There's so many instances where you can use these things that, like, anybody who plays the game is going to find themselves always being unique.
Yeah, there are already hundreds of feats, and as the game goes on, there will only be more feats to widen that, so that you have more room to make more interesting characters.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. Do you have any sort of closing remarks? I think we covered most of the things we talked about, like criticals, iterative attacks, the breakdown of weapons, obviously no classes, so there's no requirements. Did we touch on everything? I feel like we hit everything on that one.
I mean that's everything that that I wanted to touch on. No, I think a lot of people, whether they watch this or at some point they see the system at a later date, they're going to realize that things like this, that at first might not seem like a big deal to someone that's played D&D maybe regularly or maybe just a couple times. They might go like, oh, well, that's different, but what's the big deal? When they've played a game with it, they're going to see what the difference is, and I think most people are going to prefer this.
Right.
I think, I've had people of the 20 or so people that have played with the system so far, about a third of them were regular D&D players that had years under their belt. Most of them weren't. Everybody picked it up roughly just as easy. Like, it was new to everybody. It just made sense. And people had a lot of fun. And when we tell players that don't have prior experience, you and I will go back and forth and tell them about, the way that it is in other systems. They're baffled that, like, you'd have to do that much math on the fly, or you'd have to know all these different rule sets, or you'd have to this or that, because Sundered Age just made sense, like, right off the bat for them. And I think that's going to be the experience with weapons and other things. So, no, I feel pretty good as far as what we've covered today with weapons.
Excellent. I don't think there's any insight onto what's going to be next week. I think we should leave it as a surprise.
I know what it is, but
yeah, I don't. But I'm excited. You may have talked about it a little bit, but I've forgotten entirely. But yeah, I think that's a good place to sign off. I saw a few people jump in today, so I'd like to thank anybody who said, well, no one said hello, but the people who stopped in just
people
to check it out.
People did stop in,
yeah. So that's great news. And for the future people who are listening to this, which inevitably will happen, thank you. Appreciate you.
Yes, we appreciate you in the past and also in the future.
We're probably kings and rich at this point, right? Sitting on our golden throne. But, thank you, future people. It's nice that I'm not wearing, my golden suit yet, but whatever.
Well, I've got my mantle on that I won from beating Wizards of the Coast in a one-on-one duel in Irithil,
There you go.
That'll be the day.
Oh my god, that should be my next, that should be my troll character name in Dark Souls, Wizards of the Coast, and just let people constantly stomp me.
Oh, okay, that's where we're gonna stop.
That's where we're gonna stop.
We'll see you guys on Tuesday.
See you guys next Tuesday.